Good morning. I'm Tom Miles, Dean of the Law School. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of two faculty masterclass sessions this reunion weekend. The University of Chicago Law School's Faculty Masterclass series is always a favorite at reunion. The program connects alumni with our world-renowned legal scholars who share their latest research, ideas, and scholarship. Our faculty play an important role in social and economic policy and legal education everywhere, and we are delighted to provide this opportunity for all of you to engage with our most distinguished academics. This morning's program features two of our most beloved faculty members, Professor Saul Levmore and Professor Julie Rowan. This afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to join a masterclass with one of our newest faculty members, Professor Bridget Fahey. Now, Saul and Julie taught many of you during your time at the law school, and so you need no introduction to either. But please bear with me as I share a bit about Saul and Julie for those of you who may not have had the privilege of learning from them. Professor Saul Ledmore is well known for his extraordinary scholarship, profound commitment to interdisciplinarity, and unprecedented leadership of the entire faculty. Even by the standards of the University of Chicago, the breadth of Professor Ledmore's intellectual interests are extraordinary. He has taught or written about torts, corporations, copyright, nonprofit organizations, comparative law, public choice, corporate tax, commercial law, insurance, and contracts. To many of us, Professor Levmore will forever be Dean Levmore. He was Dean of the University of Chicago Law School from 2001 to 2009, a period of incredible intellectual activity among the faculty, a reinvigoration of our building and classroom wing, and an astonishing intellectual vibrancy among students and faculty, to mention just a few of his many accomplishments. After his service as Dean, Professor Ledmore was named the William B. Graham Distinguished Service Professor of Law. Professor Ledmore has long been one of the most admired teachers at the law school. He has won the teaching award more times than my jealousy permits me to say. Joining Professor Ledmore today is the equally accomplished Professor Julie Rowan. Like Professor Ledmore, Professor Rowan's credentials are unparalleled. She graduated from Radcliffe College and then went on to receive her JD from Yale. Prior to teaching, she clerked for the Honorable Patricia Wald of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and she practiced general tax law at the Washington, D.C. firm of Kaplan and Drysdale. Professor Rowan began her teaching career at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she was the Henry L. and Grace Doherty Charitable Foundation Professor of Law. When she joined our law school's faculty, she became the Seymour Logan Professor of Law at Chicago. She has taught classes in federal income tax, federal tax policy, local government law, state and local finance. Professor Rowan has published extensively, and she is the leader of the annual University of Chicago Tax Conference, the leading conference of its kind. Professors Levmore and Rowan are truly pillars of our law school community, which is why it's so fitting that they are kicking off our Faculty Masterclass series during reunion weekend. It's also fitting that they're delivering a talk entitled Troubled Cities, which is based on a Greenberg seminar they are teaching this year. Greenberg Seminars offer students the opportunity to engage in informal discussions with law school faculty members on a range of topics. Greenbergs, as they are affectionately called, were created when Professor Levmore was Dean of the Law School and are funded by Daniel Greenberg, class of 1965, and his wife, Susan Steinhauser. Please join Professor Levmore and Professor Rowan's Mini-Greenberg Faculty Masterclass on Troubled Cities. Saul and Julie, the floor is yours.
I like when the floor is ours. So here's the structure. Welcome, everyone. Whether you're seeing this live or you're seeing this later on after its delivery. So on most of the topics and with most of the questions, which you can submit, as you know, on chat, I'll try to say something first and then turn the floor over to Julie, who knows much more about cities, probably than all of us combined. And then we'll take opposite tones as home and at the law school and here. I'm an optimist about almost everything, and Julie worries. She's a pessimist. I think she loves law, but she worries that society is always on the verge of crumbling, and this will come through in this talk. So here's the general theme of what our Greenberg Seminar and what today is about. I love cities. I think they have been over the last 100,000 years, I think, the way civilization has progressed. This is not an original idea. This is well documented, well thought out. You take a bunch of humans, and as long as they're not starving and killing one another, and you put them in compressed space, they talk to one another. They have ideas. A has an idea, joins with B and C, B brings another thing to the table or criticizes A, B, C together do much more than the sum of the parts. That's the miracle of cities. I mean, society barely stood around for 10 or 20,000 years, and then various technologies developed. People came to live together in compressed spaces, and they did extremely well. Almost all innovations came out of cities and so forth. And it's very modern to us. I mean, we're used to reading the newspaper and see all the problems cities have. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. But you just watch where the greatest talent goes. Take our students. Even when I started teaching, which was not quite 10,000 years ago, but when I started teaching, lots of students went to middle-sized cities and even small towns back where they came from and probably had great lives there. This has become unusual. Like almost all the graduates of our law school, wherever they're from, they want to start their careers in big cities. It's vibrant, there's theater, there are restaurants, there are more restaurants and more restaurants of every kind, but they also have colleagues and friends, and there's something about people that you shove them together and they do great things. And I think this is demonstrated by where our students go, but again, more on that later. So we have this instinct for survival, and I think people have that wherever they live, but you put them together, they suddenly have an instinct for improvement, and they're constantly using it to get better places. Now, I'm a sort of law and economics person, but probably most of you remember at law school, you ran into Thibault hypothesis. Some of you called it Thibault, but I've since met his niece who says Thibault, so I'll go with that. And Thibault had this idea of cities like members of a market. A city offered some combination of taxes and goods, maybe big parks there, maybe really great schools there, or maybe lower taxes there with fewer public goods. And then people could choose, they could move, except maybe the least privileged people. Very hard to move countries, it's somewhat hard to move states. But you look around Chicago, people can live in a lot of suburbs, they can live in a city or another city nearby. They can even live in Gary, Indiana, if they want to do that. So they can move around to different combinations. And Thibault said, look, this is a good thing because people can get the combination they want of taxes and various public goods. Now, there's a downside to this, and I think this is what we see in modern times. Like sometimes cities fail. Julie will give you a good picture of that. Like you did not want to live in Pittsburgh in the 1970s. It faced a hard time. Some of us think it's because the government was corrupt. Other people have other explanations. They might blame unions. They might blame rich people. But whoever it is you blame, the evidence is that lots and lots of people left Pittsburgh and went to Phoenix. I mean, they obviously didn't all go to Phoenix, but I'll make believe that was a big migration. And there've been a lot of migrations like that. So you could think of it as competition. Thibault would say, look, this is great. Some businesses fail, other businesses rise. Maybe Pittsburgh learned a lesson and it came up with a different combination of corruption and taxes and museums or whatever it is that Pittsburgh did. It shifted its innovation, it shifted its factories and so forth. So the rise of Phoenix, may in the long run be a good sign of what works in cities. Some fail, some rise, populations grow and fall. Even now, we used to think of California and the big cities there as the future. My mother visited California the first time, came back to New York and said, I really don't understand why everybody doesn't live in California. I mean, that was very much the feel in the 1970s or whenever she said that. Now California and like Illinois has lost population, a couple 100,000 people a year for the last few years. You can think of it as taxes. You can think of it as, Julie would say, they're afraid of, horrible weather and water problems coming and all that. But whatever it is, it doesn't mean, I don't think it's bad news. I think it's like competition among cities and among a lot of other things. Yet the people in these cities, I think, are doing very well. Now, law plays a big role in this. I'm going to start winding down now. Law plays a very big role. I mean, think of the growth of suburbia. Some people love it, and the suburbs do compete. But in the long run, it's probably, a disaster for the planet. People are driving all over the place and using a lot of energy, living in these houses that use a lot of energy. compared to, say, one big building in Chicago, which can house a lot of these people more efficiently. And it's law that took this tax money from people buying energy, so to speak, and put it into roads and other things. So law has a lot to do with how many people live in one place than the other. And I think this is something we're seeing in modern times. It's not just our students that are moving to big cities, but big cities are much more energy efficient, and probably law will move in that direction. Now, I do want to say something a little puzzling to me at least, which is, where do these economies of scale stop and where do they go? So I think I've hinted at the case for cities putting people in amalgamation form, and they're doing very well. You've already heard that from me twice, so I won't go back there. But I don't believe that everywhere. For example, Harvard Law School is a lot bigger than our law school, but I think our law school has better amalgamation features. I mean, the faculty talk to each other, the students meet one another. Don't worry, this is not a fundraising pitch. But I mean, it seems to do very well. I think the size of our law school is much better than if these 35 faculty members all lived in their homes and never came to work. They do gain a lot by interacting with one another. So why isn't Harvard much better than Chicago? After all, it has 3 times as many faculty. You know, why isn't there an economy of scale there? And I think our answer is, well, there's something about small communities that maybe brings out the best in people. They feel more competitive, or they think everyone needs me to go to work tomorrow. I'm more useful. There aren't 100 of me. There are only 35 of me. So I am a little bit confused sometimes about how big is the right amount of big. I think our law school is probably the right size, but I also think the city of Chicago is, you know, a good size. And if it doubled in population, I would think it was good if the suburbs shrank and the city of Chicago grew. I'm glad when people from Gary and Hammond come to Chicago to work or to play or whatever, because they interact with other people. They bring their ideas back home. I think of those cities as part of Chicago, if you will. So I don't claim to, I'm not claiming some great insight here. It's just that it's not everywhere. It's not in every market that I think Thibault brings out the best, and size is always good. Compactness can also be good. The same is true of law firms, of course. You know, they grow, but some small law firms do even better, and they can also amalgamate ideas. Well, let me turn it over to Julie now before addressing some of the questions.
Okay. Well, I actually don't disagree with Saul nearly as much as he makes it seem, because I certainly agree that some scale is beneficial. There's been relatively little innovation or economic growth derived from isolated, low population rural outposts, although there's certainly been enormous gains in productivity in those rural outposts. You can just sort of think of the Green Revolution and other agricultural growth. Usually those production increases are traceable to technological innovations that were developed in cities. I mean, there is no question but that the amalgamation of people does lead to greater interaction and stimulation of ideas. But where I sort of get off the train with Saul's analysis is that I think there are real diseconomies of scale, both physical and governmental. I mean, the bigger and denser the city, the more complicated and often the more expensive the infrastructure required to make it livable. And many day-to-day interactions become more difficult, more expensive, and more time-consuming as cities grow larger. Yes, you can get everything you could ever want in Chicago or New York, but the extra time that one spends coping with the logistics of satisfying one's daily needs may mean there's no time available to partake of that everything, so that one might feel even more deprived when one lives in a city than one lives in, well, maybe not a small town, but a medium-sized town. From a political standpoint also, larger cities are often less well-governed than those that are less dense and smaller, partly because of complexity. It's just harder to govern these large cities than it is to govern small cities. partially because the complexity makes it harder for citizens to ride herd on their politicians. You just don't know as much about the politicians. You're choosing politicians to decide bigger packages of benefits and services than if you were operating in a smaller jurisdiction, and partially because the expense of running a political campaign in a large jurisdiction is just much higher than a small jurisdiction, and that makes it harder for certain people to participate in the political process. So, in a sense, the very wealth of cities may encourage corruption because it increases rent-seeking opportunities. So there are clearly trade-offs between size and density and effective government and pleasurable lifestyles. Where this comes into play now is we've now, because of the pandemic, seen a lot of people experience telecommuting. I mean, it's been made necessary by the pandemic, but it's also been made possible by technological innovations, largely, I might add, which were developed not in San Francisco proper, but in Silicon Valley, which started out as a suburb of San Francisco. And this experience of telecommuting is surely making some of these trade-offs between density and scale more evident. In fact, it may be enough to make some large employers rethink what has actually been a fairly recent decision to move corporate headquarters from suburbs to cities. And if that happened, it would be a financial disaster for many of our large cities. We might see a reversal of the migration to big cities if employees decide and employers think they can accommodate just occasional commutes into the city with most of the work done at home or at more localized offices. Like Saul, I was struck by the number of students in our seminar that only wanted to live in the city for a few years. They saw their long-term future as, yes, we'll spend the first years working hard, meeting our colleagues in the city, but then they expect to move out to the suburbs and spend as much time in the suburbs as possible. And suburbs have their problems, but it's remarkable how in the modern era, talented people move from cities to suburbs for a variety of reasons, and online capabilities, newly developed online capabilities, like the ones we're using right now, might further remove some of the advantages of density that Saul spoke about. More generally, of course, one has to think about the value or the lack thereof of already built up physical assets in cities. If we're really going to move to a carbon neutral economy, let alone eliminate all lead plumbing, it may be more expensive to retrofit existing infrastructure than to start fresh in another location or locations, particularly if one takes into account the effects of the climate change that we've already baked in. I mean, the costs of erecting seawalls around New York and Miami and other cities may be greater than rebuilding on higher ground while integrating new technologies like geothermal heating and things of that nature, just as we have encouraged some towns that live in floodplains to basically give up and be rebuilt on higher ground. We might end up deciding that the best course of action for some cities is basically to say, let's leave, let's move everything someplace else. I mean, we could be moving towards the modern equivalent of slash and burn agriculture by relocating to new jurisdictions. So for better or worse, I think the technological change seems to be making the country more Tibu-like by making one of the conditions for beneficial competition that's baked into that model more realistic, namely that people may be able to start earning their living anywhere. It may give people more freedom to choose between big cities and smaller cities. So I don't know that I consider this to be particularly pessimistic, but I think it's quite possible that we might be moving to a new sort of paradigm where people replace the bigger is better paradigm with a big enough paradigm, and think that that's the way that society and residential patterns should move. So.
Okay, well, I have to say, Julie, you got me a little nervous when you talk about flooding, because I don't know what to say about that. I think what you mean is, I mean, I understand what you mean, but I think the point is something like, well, the cities grew near water because it was easy to have transportation, or people thought it was pretty, and they may just have guessed wrong. Like they didn't think, uh-oh, the very thing I like might flood with climate change or just with, probabilistic stuff. And so maybe the cities were built in the wrong place. Like maybe they should have this amalgamation, but they should have been 15 miles inland or something like that. I guess that's possible. There's no city in the United States of big, meaning even more than a couple 100,000 people, that's not on a body of water. Water. Right. So, and maybe rivers don't flood as much and things like that. And we have some big cities on rivers. So I guess I have to think about that a little bit. Do you want to say anything else, or can I turn to questions and then engage?
You can turn to questions.
All right. So people are free to send in questions on chat, and I'll keep track of those, but I already have some that have been submitted. So here's number one. Thank you for the question askers. They did not identify themselves, although I could make believe just by coming up with first names and thanking them, but I don't really know who asked them. So here's the first question. It basically says, what about urban planning? Most of these cities have grown without urban planning. How can this problem be solved or mitigated? I'll go first, and I'll try to be quick, Julie, since I'm reading the questions out loud. So I think Julie knows what I'm going to say, and those of you who had me in class certainly know, which is, I don't know, what's the problem? I believe in markets, generally speaking, like where urban planning is needed, people will pay for it and so forth, but it doesn't always work. I think to be a good urban planner or to rely on it, you need to be able to predict the future. So for example, I think urban planners think, okay, we need parks, therefore we should plan to have parks. It's very hard, even I will concede, it's very hard for a market to suddenly turn buildings into parks. You got to get rid of all those people, relocate them, decide where the park goes. Even when you have the park, it's very hard to charge people every time they want to use the park. It's impractical. So it's a good product of city planning, creating parks early enough that it's not so expensive to do, that people can build their houses around them and so forth. So I think good urban planning means being able to predict the future for something that the market can solve easily, like parks. There are medium things also, like schools. Now, schools are a subject close to our hearts, and maybe to many of you. I don't mean just universities. So in a way, the market can solve it. Like if it's bad schools, people can build private schools. It can throw out the government and come up with better schools. You could build schools. The nation is going to church less than it used to. And maybe a lot of these churches will become schools. So it's not quite like big parks. Probably new schools can be created. I don't know that urban planners can really solve the problem that a lot of cities have of very, very high taxes that go to support the schools, and then the schools aren't very good, either through corruption or tradition or difficult families. And a lot of things that attract people to the suburbs are that for the same money, sometimes less, sometimes more, but for the same money, they're producing much better schools in many cases, and that attracts young parents to the schools. It's not something that I think urban planning can do. It's more something that voters have to do eventually. They have to really, punish governments that can't produce good schools for the money. So I worry about that a little bit. Now, wide roads are sort of my last example. It really helps if the urban planner figures out what size roads you need and how many you need and where they go. Chicago has much wider roads than New York, where I lived as a kid. It's great. You can really drive places in Chicago. And then the city requires or encourages garages that are expensive, but there's also public transit and all that. It seems to work pretty well in some cities and not others. But it's very hard to plan. Like even now, we really don't know, what the future of cars is. Like there could be more cars because of electric cars. There could be many fewer cars if people are living in high rises. The Ubers could take over the world. Really, really hard to know whether a good urban planner now would put a lot of big roads in or decrease the number of roads because people won't need them in the future, and rather they should be urban walkways. So I don't really know. I don't think it's a disadvantage of cities. I just don't have a lot of faith that urban planners will be that good at predicting the future. Julie, what do you think about urban planning in this regard?
I think urban planning is incredibly difficult, and our experience with urban planning is mixed at best. I mean, one of the primary aspects of urban planning has been zoning. And of course, nobody likes zoning anymore, or it's at least very controversial because there's so much exclusionary zoning, right? So when you start talking about urban planning, I get a little bit uncomfortable because so much of it has proven to be counterproductive in a lot of ways. On the other hand, you look at third world cities where they forgot to plan in the water supply or the sewer system or something like that. And it's obvious that you have to have some amount of planning to have necessary public infrastructure. So, it ends up being, I think it ends up being a sort of political decision as to what's the proper scope of urban planning and what should be off limits from urban planners. There's obviously, if you look around even this country, there's an enormous divergence in the amount of urban planning that goes on. I mean, Houston doesn't have any zoning. It also incorporates all of its nearby suburbs. Then there are other jurisdictions that have enormous zoning rules, some of which are used as revenue-raising devices. So in a sense, this is a question that is impossible to answer because the scope of what you mean by urban planning is too indefinite to give a single answer to.
Well, this is just like law school. They ask really good questions and then we say, well, I don't know, can't really answer that one. So I like that. I'll give you another one that we can't answer. Now we have a lot of questions, but feel free to send more in. Some of them are a little bit duplicative, as you'd expect. So here's a question that we didn't address at all, which is essentially, what's the relationship between the growth of cities and crime? So sometimes we associate cities with crime. It's a little confusing, right? New York has a declining crime rate over the last 20 years. Chicago has been more stubborn, a high murder rate, a high serious crime rate. So some cities up, some cities down. But then you look around the world, so China has had enormous growth in cities, and they don't seem to be associated with crime. You get the question, the relationship between crime and cities, or crime politics and cities. Again, I'll go first with less to say, and then Julie will say this is a hard question, but actually she'll answer it in her self-deprecating way. So I also find this confusing. I think it is a matter of wealth and jobs and poverty. It's very rare to find serious crime committed by people who have decent jobs. I mean, they work, it's an easier lifestyle. You can make more money having a job than committing crimes. I mean, maybe I'm not the only one that's thought about this, but when I was a kid, I fantasized about playing third base for the New York Yankees. That didn't happen, by the way. And I also fantasized about becoming a bank robber and a car thief. And, they were not good jobs. Like, it really is hard to support a family by stealing cars or robbing banks. You've really got to move around because the police can catch you if you repeat. it has, oh, it's not so easy to be a good criminal. Okay, so why are there a lot of criminals? Well, they get into arguments, they have mental health problems, or they can't control their rage, or, whatever it is. But a lot of it is that they don't have good jobs. So, maybe cities could solve that better than, far out places, right? That's what happened to China, I think. People were in farms. We started needing much less labor in farms, same as in Soviet Union. Farms became super efficient, and parents would send their kids into cities where they could get jobs. These Chinese cities are really, really impressive. I mean, they grow from nothing to 2 million people overnight. The roads go in. I mean, it's really incredible. And the crime rate is very, very low. People are much better off than they were out in the farm. They could barely survive out there. They come into the city. It's not a job we want. That first generation in the city is like many of our ancestors, first generation in the United States. I mean, they're sacrificing for the next generations. But the life is much better than it was back in some, I don't want to pick on a country, but much better than it was in Ireland, or better than it was in Poland, or some place where they could barely survive out on a farm. And they came here, and by 1 or 2 generations later, the kids are thriving and getting elected and running companies and so forth. I think that's what's happening in China. I mean, so we can watch the growth of cities, and there's low crime, partly because people are required to work. Vietnam is another good example. If you don't have a job, then you've got to get drafted. Like, that's the condition. You either go to the army or you have a job. I think it's kind of brilliant for a new country, not a democracy, but very smart. So it works pretty well, and the crime rate is very, very low. I think that's what will happen in the United States. So I don't think of cities as causing crime. I think as unemployment as causing crime. It's the only thing that makes me worry about guaranteed national income, which I happen to be a fan of if it could take the place of a lot of more costly programs of redistribution. But a problem is that, most people don't want handouts. They want to feel productive and useful. But so if you give people a lot of money, it may be that crime will go up because they're not occupied with jobs and trying to improve themselves. So I'm not really sure about the relationship, but I don't think there's an international, set of statistical evidence pieces that suggests that, cities will increase crime or decrease crime. I think they are not quite related problems. Julie?
Well, on the China point, I sort of agree with you. If you're working a 60 or 70-hour week, which is what an awful lot of the people in China are working, you just don't have time for criminal activities. You do have time if you don't have a job, or your job is a part-time job. And you also have incentive if your job just doesn't pay well and you're not really worried about losing it. So I think that a lot of crime is due to unemployment. Certainly not all due to unemployment, but a lot of it is due to just opportunity, right? And it would help a lot, I think, if people had opportunities to and took advantage of opportunities to have good jobs. That's obviously not going to solve everything. There are plenty of people with money who commit crimes, plenty of people with jobs who commit crimes. There is, after all, a whole field called white collar crime, which is actually a really fun area to practice in. So there's a cultural element too. And I think that China is a different situation because I think that there's been a lot of mass indoctrination, which which has had an effect on crime rates. It's also had an effect on other things that we might not be so happy about, but stressing the community as opposed to the individual, I think does tend to have a reduced crime rates, which are because crime is a very individualistic way of approaching transactions, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of good questions here. I'm going to combine a couple of them into one. First of all, a few people point to cities that are not on bodies of water. There's a whole literature on this. I'm not sure I want to argue about that now. I didn't say navigable body of water, just for those of you that ask questions. Phoenix, for example, has a lot of water, so let's not quibble about that. A few people wrote about Phoenix. So I'm not going to go to the water thing. It's not really important right now. A couple of comments are about, well, wait a minute, there's this confusion about cities. Some of them, there's huge reduction in productivity because of long commuting times. Julie and I, for example, hate commuting. We tried it once. That's an advantage that big cities have because people can live in them and save commuting time, save many hours a day. It's all your free time is gone if you commute. So I think that is another thing that suggests the growth of cities. So it's a little bit orthogonal to where we are. The question that really intrigues me the most is both mid-sized cities and people's ability to leave them. And so maybe only rich people are really migrating. Maybe Thibault is about people wealthy enough to move cities. Just like, you can go to England if you don't like it here. Well, that's not going to be true for most poor people. And linked with that in our country especially is what's the relationship between race and cities. I mean, in our country, new immigrants and Black Americans are statistically much more likely to live in big cities. So how does that affect the growth of cities? Does it get you nervous when people are moving from Pittsburgh to Phoenix? Maybe that makes some groups more disadvantaged than the others. So there's a lot packed in there, and I'll make a few observations. And then I'm sure Julie will have a lot to say. So one of it is, in our lifetime, there's a real shift. I mean, Chicago is a great example. Chicago is pretty stable in size. The suburbs are now growing again, but it's the southern suburbs that are growing. And it's mostly well-employed Black people moving out of the city and moving to southern suburbs. So that's a very interesting development. I mean, we used to think of it as white flight, and that was what it was called accurately. Now, famously, Chicago and a few other cities are not experiencing white flight at all, except by our law students. They're experiencing Black flight. As soon as families can afford to, they're often moving out of the city. Often, again, it's because the kids want their kids to go to different schools and so forth. So it's a little mixed. It's hard to know where the future will be in terms of race and cities. I mean, our news pays a lot of attention to the growth in the number of Black mayors and so forth, but and less attention to the growth of Black suburbs or Black-white integrated suburbs, as many are. So I think this is confusing. Confusing meaning we don't know what will happen. Think of the huge immigrant populations now. It's obvious why people move to cities. They look to some degree for people that they can speak with if they don't speak English yet, and to sort of familiar surroundings and food sources and so forth. But very quickly they move to suburbs. Detroit was a famous example of that. So a lot of immigrants, by sort of half their lifetime, was spent in a city and then they moved out. Again, it's really hard to know what will happen to that. I don't think urban planners are very good at that. So I don't really have much to say about that, except to point that I don't think it changes the fact that ideas come from cities and that energy saving comes from cities and so forth. But we should be aware that Thibault works for a lot of low income people. They move out of the city into a nearby suburb. They don't like what the city, they get jobs, they're taxed very heavily. You see this in New York. People can't afford, people making $100,000 leave Manhattan because the tax rates are very high and they might go to New Jersey and so forth. Julie?
I think one of the big failures of cities has been that they haven't, I don't think there's a single large city that has a decent educational system. I don't know why they don't have a decent educational system. It's not entirely a lack of money. It seems to be a much deeper problem than that. And it's a problem that's existed for a very, very long time. I mean, both of my parents actually grew up in Chicago. My mother lived in South Shore until, well, she grew up in South Shore. My father grew up in Austin. My father, who was a University of Chicago college and law school graduate, once told us that he graduated from high school and did not know that if you added up all the numbers in a column, the total at the bottom had to be larger than any of the numbers that were in that column. I mean, that's just something that never got taught.
Meaning he never learned about negative numbers, I guess.
Well, they didn't do.
That was a joke,
never.
Julie, I
yes,
promise.
I know. They never got to negative numbers, and nonetheless, he did fine at University of Chicago because he ran into my mother, who was actually an elementary school teacher in Chicago, and her experience teaching in the Chicago public schools. And we're now talking 60 years ago, 70 years ago, I don't know, were dismal. She said the most important person in the school was the janitor, the building maintenance person, not the principal, but the building maintenance person. Because if you weren't friendly with the building maintenance person, just horrible things happened to your classroom. When you don't have a functioning educational system, the people that go through that educational system have no chance in life. They didn't have any chance then. They sure don't have any chance now. And at this point, I don't know what the solution is for school systems. That is, of course, exactly, one of the major reasons all of our students say, oh yeah, we'll go to the cities for a few years, but then want to move out to the suburbs because they can't see themselves sending their kids to the New York public schools or the Chicago public schools. That is a tremendous problem. And until we solve that, I don't see any solution to these social problems that, and you're absolutely right that it's very hard for a lot of people to leave the cities, but as soon as people get money, that does seem to be what they do if they have some amount of money and kids, is they try and escape the dysfunctional educational system. I think the educational systems are what's key. And that seems to be, it seems to be something that at least in this country has no solution for.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a real, if there's one thing that makes me worry for our country, it's all the money spent on not producing very good educational systems. Again, China is a good comparison. Sometimes our kids used to learn something in lab school, which is obviously a pretty privileged place. And they would come home and they learned something and they were really good at it. And I would think to myself, let's not get too smug about this. There are probably, 300 million people in China that learned to do this, 5 years younger than you. I mean, the schools are very, very good and people are learning a lot of skills and all that. If Martha Nussbaum were here, she would say, oh, they're not learning English literature and philosophy. But, Julie and I, maybe through the younger generation's eyes, see, no, you need a lot of people who are tech savvy and so forth. We have a really good question here, close to my heart, about benefit programs. So as some of you know, there are some cities, usually in California, Oakland is a good example, Marin County in general is a good example, that have what some people call benefit programs. Like if you live in the city and you could show you've been there a while, then they have their own healthcare system, essentially. So, we think of national healthcare or not. Well, there are cities that promise to provide more upscale healthcare for everybody who lives there, or more upscale something else. But healthcare might be a very good example. And, what do you think of that? Is that an advantage of cities and so forth? One of the books we read in our Greenberg Seminar was about New York City in the 70s. So you could think of New York City as I grew up there, you could think of it as an early benefit program city because it provided colleges. I mean, there was the City College in New York, and then I lived 1 or 2 blocks from Queens College, where my sister-in-law went. I mean, these were really pretty good colleges. A lot of Nobel Prize winners came out of City College, for example. Okay, it was free, essentially free. Half my high school class went to City College. I mean, that was the place to go. If you didn't go to a religious school, which most of my class did, or, I went to Columbia, maybe 4 people went to Ivy League schools out of my high school. So City College can be thought of as a benefit program, and it raised taxes because colleges were expensive to support, but New York City offered it. It was like a hallmark of the system. Mayors were properly proud of them and so forth. So it was what healthcare is to some of these Western cities now. Well, the good news is that there are a lot of people that are willing to pay for it, not just benefit from it. So immigrants go there, get educated, they move up the social ladder faster. And then there are people that lived in New York that were very proud of paying higher taxes and having city college there. Like it was a good way. You might think big and want the whole world to provide free education, but you could live in New York and give charity, we might call it today, but it wasn't charity, it was your tax system, and you provided schools. Well, as you know, if you're as old as I am, and as you know, if you were in our seminar, New York collapsed. It essentially went bankrupt and was rescued in a variety of ways. And one of the things it was forced to do, aside from growing the city colleges, which was a political demand, was to start charging money to go to city college and start having open admissions and create many, many more colleges, charge more money, more colleges. The quality went down. In a way, it's good. More and more people went to college. You can think of it as a kind of community college outpost. Maybe they wouldn't have gone to college otherwise. In a way, it was bad in that it encouraged people who did very well in high school and board scores and all that to move out of the city and go to colleges elsewhere. So there are very, very few Nobel Prize winning people coming out of the system now. That's not necessarily bad. Cities don't necessarily have to provide the best healthcare or the best colleges. It's a matter of, raising a lot of people. So I kind of have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it might be a really good way to provide benefits to people who live there, and especially allow people who are willing to redistribute something of their own income to live in these places and pay. The problem, obviously, is that there might be a lot of people who think they're being taken advantage of. I don't want to pay higher taxes so that other people can go to City College of New York. So they move out of New York or they take their business out of New York, and then some cities go bankrupt. I feel that way about a lot of issues. Some of you may have read stuff I've written about reparations, for example. I'm a big fan of certain kinds of reparations. And until we get there, or even if we never get there, I think private reparations are not a bad idea. We could create accounts where people who wanted to redistribute to reparations could put money into a fund. And if there was not enough money, they get their money back. If there's enough money, then it serves a kind of reparations. So you could voluntarily choose, kind of Thibaut inside your own head, to choose to live in a different kind of, you don't have to live in a Marin County in order to believe in healthcare, reparations, and so forth. It could be done at the individual level. I know this is not quite our topic, but cities are a good way to think about it. The failure in the past has been that they get a little out of control and then people leave New York and New York is required to charge. But I'm optimistic. I think there's a lot of room for experimentation with this. Eventually, there will be cities that try to have different kind of police forces, some more, some defunded, some this, some that, and we'll get experiments to see what works. I think the same thing might be true of healthcare. Might be that some cities will try internal healthcare systems, some won't. We'll see which ones work, which cities are abandoned. I don't know, Julie, what do you think about that? Super Thibaut.
Well, as I said earlier, and as we've said earlier, Thibaut works for people who have the opportunity to leave. And as long as cities basically have to create a situation in which people want to stay and redistribute their money. They have to provide enough amenities to the people who are the only people who can afford to redistribute money to stay there. And if they don't, they are going to see flight. Absolutely. Because they'll see flight because who wants to stay and see your money redistributed and basically get, I won't say get nothing back, but it's a trade-off for people. A longer commute, somebody's asked this question. Yes, people are trading longer commutes in order to get certain benefits of suburbs. It's a trade-off. And if the schools are terrible in the city are terrible enough, and somebody else said, how much of this is perceived versus real? After all, there's some good public schools, but the percentage of good public schools in the city of Chicago is actually sort of dismally small. Just my mother graduated from South Shore High School, which now has 20% of the students reading and achieving math at grade level. I thought that was dismal till I looked at the statistics for my father's high school, which is Austin High School. They have a 2% on track record. So if that's the sort of situation that you're facing when you're thinking about raising a family in the city, you either have to have enough money to send your kids to private school, which is very expensive, or you're going to give up a lot of time and commute and go out to the suburbs. And what I think is very dangerous about this particular point in time is that it's becoming clear that people may not actually have to commute. That there may be ways that they can arrange their lives so that they can do the jobs that they used to do in the cities and do those jobs in the suburbs. And that is an incredible threat to the survival of many of our large cities. Because if they can both work in the suburbs and also send their kids to school in the suburbs, they will just stay out of the city entirely. And we will be back to a period of time where I remember the city of Chicago, where the city was absolutely dead after 5:30 at night. There was no one downtown because no one wanted to live anywhere close to the city. It's now a very different situation. You know, there are all these people who want to live in the city because it does seem very vibrant and what have you. But I wonder if that's sustainable.
Yeah, Julie and I are old-fashioned about this, as you can see. In fact, our kids, I don't think they mean it nicely, call us crypto Republicans sometimes, and I even more than Julie. So I'll say something, politically incorrect in agreement with her, but even more so. I think that, it's very, very important to think about, inequality. I admire our society for thinking about this a lot. But there are two ways to think about it. I mean, one way, which is the current New York way, is to think about income inequality as, oh, we'd all be better off if everything was equal. And the other way to think about it is, well, we'd all be better off if a lot of people rose, or we'd all be better off if there was more equality at a high level or at a medium level, but not at a low level. I mean, you don't want the whole city to be like Austin High School, which Julie just cited. I mean, if that's what equality means, we're in very, very deep trouble. I mean, other countries will surpass us. That'll be the first danger sign. And then immigrants won't want to come here because it won't be a place to rise. I mean, it'll be a disaster. I think the trick is to try to make places like, I've never been in Austin High School, though I've been in Austin. The trick will be to make Austin rise, not to make lots and lots of schools as bad as that high school and as bad as the outcome. We have several graduates whom I met when I was dean who run businesses in Chicago that, really were social, do-good people, tried to train people at some of these high schools, Austin in particular in one case, and then hire them in their businesses. And, it was a disaster. I mean, hard as they tried, they couldn't get people to come to work. They couldn't get people to stay in class. All those jobs went to immigrants, some recognized immigrants, some unrecognized immigrants. The jobs just couldn't be given to people who finished Austin High. I mean, this is a real social disaster for society. So I think everybody understands what I mean. And I wish I had a solution to it. I mean, once upon a time, we thought Teach for America or competition among schools would be a kind of solution. That seems mixed. On average, these schools seem pretty good, but there are a lot of failure cases that people point to. Teachers' unions are obviously opposed to them. It's not obvious that, in our lifetime, competition among these schools will improve things. I think it really requires electing politicians who are willing to take steps to make these schools better off. And it's not high school teacher wages. I mean, that's another popular thing to say. Oh, look at the suburbs. They pay teachers more. We need to pay teachers more in Chicago, then everything will be better. No, maybe in the long run, that'll attract more people to be high school teachers or grade school teachers. But if you look around the country, there's a lot of evidence about this. The states that have the best performing students, I mean, at the middle level or the low level, I don't mean the people that go to Harvard, they have very low teacher salary. Idaho has very low teacher salaries, just to take one example, very, very well performing schools. So it's not an easy fix. It's not a matter of throwing more money at it. And I think this is what we need to vote for, and this is what we do. I wish that had something to do with law school. I mean, it's not a legal problem exactly, unless you think this all has to do with unions. It has to do with the focus of political officials and maybe solving crime problems first alongside school problems. I mean, there are a lot of things going on. And by the way, I'm not pessimistic. I continue to be really optimistic. The schools way out in the suburbs and the schools in rural areas are often just as bad. It's not like if there's competition among the suburbs, those schools do pretty well. If you want your kid to get a good education, moving to the middle of nowhere, as Chicagoans like to say about every place they've never heard of, that's not a solution. A lot of those schools are really terrible, and there are crime rates there as well. I think it's putting people together to amalgamate, if there's such a word, and then watching them thrive and not be torn down by bad schools and bad crime is really the solution. Julia,
I just wanted to say that someone on the chat thing brought up, but there's these selective admission schools, that's a solution. And I'm sort of sitting here thinking, well, it's a solution for the small number of children who get into the selective admission schools. And we have to worry about who those children are. I mean, the New York Times article yesterday said, there were 8 African Americans that were placed into Stuyvesant High School in this most recent round of testing. 8? Really? So we have different rules for placing. Chicago has different rules for placing students into these selective high schools, but I wonder how well all of the children in the selective high schools do, as opposed to just some of the children in the selective high schools. And besides which, it's an infinitesimal percentage of the Chicago schools children. So there are just so many children who are in terrible schools that we don't seem to understand how to fix. And until we can, I don't think that there's a real solution for an admitted problem with big cities, which is there are a lot of rich people, there are a lot of poor people, and there's almost nobody in between, because the people who are in between can't afford the city. Even if they could afford a place to live, they don't have a decent place to put their children in school, and you start to look like Latin America. And that's just not good for our
Speaking
society.
of crypto Republicans, I've been to South America several times. I thought some of the schools were very good. We're going to finish up.
Some of them are.
We're going to finish up pretty soon and say thank you, but I want to finish on an optimistic note, which I am optimistic, which is you watch our law students wanting to live in big cities. The law students are fantastic. And if they want to live in big cities, the cities will thrive. And some of them will stay in cities, their kids will go to school, and these people will force the government to make the schools better. Similarly, there'll be a lot of people who would make great school teachers. If they want to live in cities because of the restaurants and the friendship groups and all that, great. That means there'll be a lot of good school teachers living in big cities or medium-sized cities and so forth. You don't see people who would be good teachers, the sort of people you want your kids to have teach them. You don't see them saying, oh, I want to move and be a teacher way out, in Montana. I mean, those days are gone. They want to live in big cities, so I have a lot of hope for big cities. I am going to say that's the final word, and mostly thank everybody who's listening in real time and later time. I feel sad for you, and almost as sad for our law school, that is to say your law school, that we're not all here in person. So please come visit. You can always sit in on classes if you like, and in very Chicago style, you can sit in on classes and raise your hand and ask a question. Be great. Come back to law school. We want you and we need you. And thank you so much for coming to this.